All right, so welcome everybody to the last of our Friday webinar August series for employing linguistics. This is our whole lineup. We've gained perspective, we've brightened our outlook, we've talked about superpowers, and now here today we're going to be talking about story listening. And I've invited Chrysilla Benford, Dr. Chrysilla Benford, and Dr. Catherine Nelson, both of whom are experienced story listeners. And we're going to be having a conversation about really why stories are so important, but why story listening gives you that extra oomph. I think it's great that we're following superpowers with this conversation, because there's a way that I kind of think about listening as a superpower. So when you have that superpower and you bring it to your career storytelling, kind of amazing things can happen. So I'll just do my little spiels to start off with. As you know, today is about story listening. This is derived from the approach that I first explored in bringing linguistics to work, where I talked about having a story listening, story finding, and storytelling approach. Of those three, I've really become very, very honed in on story listening. And I've taken that a few different directions. So the first one, sorry, my advancing is all over the place today. The first direction that I've applied story listening is to a product that we call Pocketful of Stories. And I'm joined by two of my co-story listeners from Pocketful of Stories. We've done a number of these in the spring. We are currently still doing them especially for anyone who's been kind of career disoriented because of the pandemic. We're offering these free to our community. Pocketful of Stories session is an hour-long session where you come, and we have a number of activities to get you finding stories and telling stories, and we bring the listening. And I think you'll hear, we'll talk a little bit today about some of the insights that can come out of taking that kind of an approach to story listening. Career Camp, which will be kicking off next week, is also designed, it's kind of my answer to creating a community of story listeners for people who are navigating a career transition or just a moment of career reorientation. I designed Career Camp to bring this story approach, so we start with story listening, we move to story finding and storytelling, but really the whole time we are listening to one another's stories. It's my answer to how do I bring people into this understanding of story, the power of story listening, so that they can bring it to their own stories and to the stories of others. So that brings us to today. And I thought I would just kick us off by saying, so another way that I have tried to bring story listening to the world is through stories that I share. And these are three women who I wanted to share in the first chapter of Employing Linguistics. So yeah, the reason for this series is I'm working on a book, Employing Linguistics. We'll say Katie's saying it's out in 2021. I think that's right. I don't know when in 2021, but sometime in 2021. But I wanted these three stories. I wanted a particular kind of three stories in the first chapter. So Charlotte Lindy here on our left, Samantha Beaver in the center, and Ann Charity Hudley on the right. All of them are first, because we know framing, when you think about framing, what comes first matters. I wanted these three stories because they are, so in Charlotte's case, she's in retirement, and I think it's important to remember that careers continue on. She's doing probably more in her retirement than it doesn't matter. It's not about more. She's doing really interesting things in her retirement. Samantha Beaver's just starting her career, and the story that I share from her in this first chapter is the moment where she decided to launch her business. And she's very much like, as she was sharing this story with me, it was about to happen. Like, she's very much in the beginning, like the moment of deciding to begin a business. And I think that story is that perspective is one that we don't hear very often. We often hear from people who've been, on a career journey for months and years, sometimes decades. But I thought it was important to include a story from someone who's just beginning, so you can get that sense of, for those of you who are also maybe beginning, get that sense that, being disoriented, being not knowing exactly where you're going is actually something to be celebrated, because it means you're innovating. It means you're embarking, you're starting. And then Anne Charity Hudley, she's kind of at the center, right? I feature a moment where she's giving a plenary to the Linguistics Society of America, top of the field, invoking one of the, top conversations that need to be happening. She's inviting our field into a conversation about white privilege and about confronting a racist past and looking forward to the future and thinking about a more inclusive discipline for linguistics. So that's my preamble. I will turn over now to our guests, our invited guests, and I will invite you to tell us a little bit about who you are and a little bit about your career story. And then I'll invite participants. One of the things that's been so great about this series is participants have been asking such great questions. So please, your questions are very, very warmly welcomed. Please give us your questions. Tell us what you're thinking about. But Priscilla Benford, let's turn over to you. You're on mute.
Hello. Thanks for showing up, everyone. My name is Priscilla Benford, and I am actually not a linguist. I am a fan of linguistics, a casual user of linguistics tools. Not so casual.
Not so casual.
Anyways, I earned my PhD many moons ago in narratology, which is the study of narrative structure. And, I was reading Anna Marie's chapter 1 yesterday and today, and thinking about different ways to tell my own story. And I was thinking about stars. And the first thing that came to me is Jane Eyre. And when I was in high school, as my sophomore year in high school, and I first read Jane Eyre, and was just so struck by it. And it came just a year after I had just read Frankenstein, which I was also very struck by. And those books, they just spoke to me more powerfully than anything I had ever read, which is very strange. People find that very strange. So I'm a narratologist, but as a narratologist, you're always supposed to pick a country and a time period where you, sort of apply your narratology to. And so I chose 19th century British literature, which has continued. It baffled people then, it continues to baffle people. But that's why it was, Jane Eyre and Frankenstein. And it was because Jane and the creature I resonated with them. They were excluded. They were mistreated by authority figures. I hated school when I was a kid, couldn't stand it, felt like all my teachers were mean. And I was like, these characters get it. They understand me. Luckily that changed in college. So I was very interested in it. As I learned more about novels and novel structure, that's how I became very interested in narratology. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to it as a second year college student, which at the time was pretty rare. And that got me thinking, like, this is what I'm going to do for my senior thesis. This is what I want to do. When I finally decided to go to grad school, which wasn't immediate, I decided this is what I want to do. And even though one of the things that I like about the Victorian period, for me as a person of color, one of the things I like is it allows me to talk about how social hierarchy is narrativized, how these beliefs about difference, about inferiority and superiority, how they circulate in a culture. And I can talk about it because the Victorians are dead and people don't get upset or think that you're talking about them. And that is, and I tried to explain this to people, and they still didn't get it. And they would say, you should study something more contemporary, but it really did help to study dead people. And so after I left academia, and part of that was I just felt that I felt too isolated from the rest of the world. And at the time I was teaching at Stanford, and I just felt I feel isolated. The students seem isolated. This just seems, well, it seems like a waste of time. And so I started casting about for what to do. And it was during that time of real career exploration that I met Anna Marie. And eventually, after a few years of knowing each other, we decided to start a business that is sort of at its core about story listening and the power of story.
Very nice. And Catherine Nelson, you want to tell us about yourself?
Hi, I am Catherine Nelson, also Katie. I think my story should start back in undergrad, because I maybe even high school. I was a mathematician through and through. That was it. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care. I liked science and math. And so I went into university, like I took summer school and right out of high school, and I had AP courses and whatnot. So I entered my first year of university as a sophomore. And I could have accelerated and gone through very quickly and finished. But I wanted something more than that. And so I was going to finish my math degree in like 2.5 years, and my entire degree. But in the process, I really, really, really wanted to study abroad. And my part of that comes from a variety of things. My aunt lived in Germany for 9 years. And so I got to visit there as a young child. Like, my first trip was to the country of West Germany when I was 3.5, or wait, 4.5, 3.5. I think it was 3.5.
Wow.
So I was very young and remember parts of it. I don't remember everything, but you can imagine that's a big difference. So anyway, those experiences stuck with me because we kept going back to visit her as I was growing up over the summers. And we'd like spend 3 weeks there running around the small town in Germany for fun. And seeing the different cultures, hearing different languages, driving around. And so I really, really wanted to study abroad. And I ended up getting to go to Siena, Italy, which was fantastic. Part of the reason I chose it is I didn't have to be fluent in the language. I could learn the language there, and that was part of the reason. But also I went in fall term, so that threw me off of my schedule to finish my math degree right away, because a lot of the classes I needed were 3-term sequences. And I ended up having to take one of those annoying general requirement courses that I was just really resenting because I was not interested in the structure of English words at all. But my brother had taken that, but I loved the class. And then the person who taught it, he was a grad student, what happened to be in my German intensive first year German course over the summer. And I ended up asking him more and more and more questions about linguistics. Can you tell me more about linguistics? Long story short, I was like, I have the time. Why don't I just start my degree? If I don't like it after 2 terms, I can always quit, but I liked it and I didn't quit was the point. I ended up getting my PhD in linguistics. And I chose something that kind of combined all of my different interests. I did acoustic phonetics. So as I describe it, the physics of speech. I did social language variation, and I worked with an indigenous tribe of North America, the Nez Perce, and studied the phonetics of their language, got to go work with them on the reservation, became, friends, and really enjoyed that and learned a lot from them. And then after that, I taught for 3 years at Illinois State University, working primarily with pre-service teachers who were getting like a TESOL certification, so that's teaching English to speakers of other languages, or working with like future K through 12 teachers who were getting some sort of certification or credential to allow them to have non-native speakers in their classroom to be able to provide them the support they needed. And then, and that is probably what made me even more interested in this language, culture, identity, education. And I've gone through some other areas. I worked for a tribe in Southern California for a year as a language curriculum developer. I worked with an education company and developed an English communication course for them. I worked with writing instruction. So like I got to do a bunch of different things. As Anna Marie knows, I've toyed with like really going full into starting a business. I mean, I do some consulting and freelancing and things, but I don't, like, that's not the main thing. So I keep toying with that and going back and forth, but that's kind of where I ended up. And I went from, math, physics into something that combined my interest for travel, my interest for language, my interest for culture with that. And one of the reasons I met Anna Marie was through a friend of mine as I was trying to figure out other non-academic career opportunities and figuring out how to explain where I came from with my experience and my background to people. So I took career camp from her and have enjoyed working with her since. So,
well, speaking of
me
explaining your career interests, I think it's really interesting, and it's probably no accident. I mean, we're talking about stories, but both of you told a story to introduce yourselves that was different from a story I've heard. I guess it was unique. The way that you crafted your stories were kind of tailored, I think, to today.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear, I'm a storyteller. It's one of the things that I do in my spare time. And last night I told a story as part of a concert. And it was the first time in a long time that I've retold a story. And I remembered how wonderful it is to get to retell a story. So I don't know, did you guys want to share anything about how you constructed your story, why the choices you made today in presenting your story the way that you did?
So in thinking about that, I was considering who has been to our webinar, your webinars in the past. I've attended these the whole month's worth, and so I was thinking about who was at these and kind of where they might be in their career. And I think, and I also thought about your introduction of the 3 different stories, somebody at the beginning of their career, somebody at the height or the middle of their career, and somebody in retirement but still doing their work. And I think for me, what made me want to explain this is like, also this comes from our conversations of the trajectory is not straight. I will tell you right now, that drives me nuts. Like, like it drives me insane. I'm like, this comes from my math background. Next step, it should build. And so I'm having to accept the ambiguity of it in a sense of, one of the reasons I said I keep toying with the business, I've been playing around with that off and on. And I was like, I'm going to do this. This was in February. What happened in March and April? And I was like, I don't know that this is a good idea right now. So this was part of like, I keep toying with it, and I was all set to do it. And I was like, I'm not sure pandemic time is the right time to really go into this full, but I think it's also a time that I chose to really continue thinking about it and what it would really be. But I think the reason I crafted the story I did is I wanted to show, and maybe I think, Chrysselia, you saying you were a narratologist and giving me a little bit more about why you were interested in that made me go back to this. I love math. I want to do things kind of math related, but I also love culture and languages and just like going places and meeting people and hearing different languages. Like I travel as much as I can and try to use languages when I travel and just meet different people. So I think it related to what I thought. You know, people are maybe earlier in the career, maybe they're in college, maybe they're grad school. It kind of, I wanted to appeal to that range. So
I I was very struck by Samantha Beaver's the the recording of her talking about um, making the decision to launch her business at the festival. And for me, the first thing I noticed was, oh, look, there's Fabula and Sujet doing their job.
Ooh, tell us.
And those are, it is the kind of very, I think, best insight that narratology has to offer the world. And it comes from the Russian formalist. And it's just this distinction between the events in their chronological order, how they actually happened and unfolded over time, and the way we might reorder them in the telling in order to create certain narrative effects. And so, what I noticed in Samantha's story, the "Okay, I'm going to do it" story, that it starts with the "Okay, I'm going to do it." Then we get the context of what this festival is. So that context is sort of giving us the stakes of, some implied stakes for what a yes would mean if everything worked out, but also, what, emotionally it might feel like if the things didn't work out, so you get this sense, which then allows us to, in the final movement of that story, where she sets the internal context. So we have the external context, and then we have the internal context. And so now that internal context makes even more sense because we heard the external context first. And this is just, and if she were, that was a spontaneous telling, although I get the sense that she's probably told it in that order many times. It's a very powerful way to order it. But you can see how she would seem different. The whole idea of saying yes to this request you can increase the drama or decrease the drama depending on how you order the story. So that just got me thinking a little bit more about my initial reactions when I first started learning about these tools, and how I actually, so I met, Jane Eyre and the creature in high school, and had, these strong reactions, but I couldn't really even make sense and didn't even quite identify with them um, as characters. Uh, but then in college, and I re-encountered them after my narratology course. And then all of a sudden I got it. I was like, oh, wow. Now I understand what was going on for me in high school. I understand, in the structure of the novel Frankenstein just jumped out at me. The structure of Jane Eyre just jumped out at me. And in fact, my senior thesis was about, so they're both Gothic novels. Jane Eyre is what's called a new Gothic. So Charlotte Bronte is reworking Gothic conventions to express other, other ideas that weren't expressed in the original run, that is the 18th century Gothic novels. And the new style that Charlotte Bronte is working with is actually inspired by Mary Shelley. And so in college and grad school, I just got very interested in what, I was thinking about at the time, and this is what I still do, the idea of taking something that has a lot of commercial value. So at the time, Gothic novels were the rage. Everybody loved them. I mean, kind of like how people like vampire stories now. I mean, that kind of thing, just very, very popular. A lot of just sort of formula fiction. Really, you could just predict it. Terrible, really. Boring to read now, because some of the things, that scared an 18th or 19th century reader were like, need a little more. But what I was interested in with Charlotte Bronte and Mary Shelley is how you take this very tired form and you breathe life into it and you make it your own, and you express your individual concerns in that. You basically take this highly commercial form and you turn it into art. And that's what I looked at in my dissertation.
Mhm.
And that's what I became very interested in my current research, which has to do with popular internet genres and user experience design strategies and techniques, and looking at what is their commercial power? Why do you see them everywhere? Why are they so popular? And then also, who's doing anything interesting with them? What interesting things can be done? And how does that impact us as people who are experiencing these techniques every time we open up our laptops? What's happening there?
Yeah.
So that led to the work that I do with the Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood. I'm on the board of that, and I work with teachers and parents and therapists, basically people who are kind of in caregiving roles for children. And we talk about, how do you talk about the internet and screen-based media to children in a way where you're promoting their ability to understand it as a made thing and not something natural.
Well, I mean, I know it's been many conversations with you that have shaped how I think about telling stories, for sure. And I think that's one of the objectives I had in chapter 1, telling these 3 stories. I told each of them in a very different way. And I think I was trying to
Mm-hmm.
call attention to the style of storytelling. But I wanted these stories to do something very specific. I'm imagining readers who are trying to quest, they're trying to think, what choices can I make? What options are there? What futures are possible? And I come at this from a very strongly held conviction that we are needed. Our ways of thinking, we bring, I come back to it again and again, like our superpowers, right? Seeing through ambiguity, even just having a little bit of critical consciousness about how stories are constructed is itself a superpower.
I love your distinction in chapter 1, which I've heard you make before, the difference between working as a linguist, or for me, working as a narratologist, um, and working like a linguist or like a narratologist. And I found, and this is part of what, as I was making my decision to leave academia, that I realized I don't need to be a narratologist. I don't need to be recognized as a narratologist. I don't need to go to the convention. I don't need to, publish in the journal. That's not what's important to me. That's
Mm,
not what I like. It is the tools. I want to use them. It has, disciplined my thinking in a particular way.
right.
And I think that that's valuable. And I want to figure out how I can use it. One of the detours that I didn't tell in my story, that I used it in a brief stint as a stylist. I was a stylist for a while with the company Stitch Fix, and I convinced them to hire me by saying that, this style is a form of expression, and that's what I've been studying my whole life. And storytelling is self-expression. Your clothes could tell a story. You dress up for the different facets of your personality. So I wrote my cover letter, sent it off, didn't hear from them. And this is when the company was really new, so you could actually get in touch with people. And so I wrote to the hiring manager and I said, hey, I haven't heard from you, but I actually think my application is pretty awesome. And she said, well, yeah, it was. We're really struck by it. But, you have a PhD, like you used to teach at Stanford. Like we were like not sure. Are you, why? She was really stunned. And I said, I am totally serious. I am totally serious. I really want this job. And she says, well, can you come in for an interview tomorrow? And I said, sure.
What?
Yeah, and it was the most fun interview I've ever had. Preparing for the interview was fun. I went to the store and I got a bunch of fashion magazines and I'm looking at them and I'm telling my husband, like, look, I'm working on these magazines. And then I went and it was just this room full of clothes. And they said, make an outfit for a lawyer who likes to think of herself as a bit goth. And I look and I make an outfit. And they're like, now make an outfit for a mom who is about to go meet her kid's teacher, for back to school night. A mom living in the Midwest. They just give you, and you had to, because part of working there is being able to put those outfits together quickly. But it was a blast, and I got the job.
And then tell a story about them, right? You created a look and then you had to tell the story of the look.
Yes, you would create the look and then you write a note that I don't know how they do it anymore. Like I said, this is when the company was very new. And then you write a story about like where you might wear this look and how, and the idea was, and my notes ended up being used for training because I got the idea, not just where you would use it, but I would say like, and how, if you held on to a piece, then it could be the basis of another look. And I would tell them like, if you want this other look, write to me and I'll make it for you. So yeah. And that was a kind of a fun part, and a little storytelling and imagining these things. Was like, you could go here and there just be these.
Well, you've got me thinking now about prepping for a job interview. And, you all have been working with me for the past few months, and this, pocket full of stories idea. That's what I would want for people, like that experience that you just described, where somebody shows up for a job interview and it's like fun because they're like they're considering doing something that they really want to do, and like the task at hand is to convey the enthusiasm and the synergy. That's what you would hope it could feel like.
That's what you would hope. I mean, but it was the fact that it was so concrete, demonstrating the skill. I didn't have to talk about it. In fact, we didn't talk really, not at all. I remember, just sort of, they introduced themselves, they explained what we were going to do, and then it was just 30 minutes of making outfits.
Wow.
And telling the story. After I made the outfit, I had to tell the story about like why I chose it and how I was imagining this character that they had, sketched for me.
So I guess that's what I'm saying. I think in your everyday job interview, you maybe aren't going to get to be as tactile as that, but that if you have the raw ingredients of stories, you can spend a lot of time at a job interview storytelling and have that experience of, imagination, putting yourself into the task, imagining what you would be like doing this task. I don't know. What's been your experience, Katie? I see you unmute yourself.
Well, I was going to mention something different, so I don't want to change that. Well, I was just going to say, like, one of the things that has come up a couple times we haven't like explicitly stated was like audience design. I mean, like we are talking about how you change the way you explain something based on who you're talking to. So like, how do you explain to one person, your story versus another person, your story? So like, I mentioned I chose the story about my past based on who I thought might be in the audience today. And Crescelia, you were talking about, you applied for this job and, were applying your skills that you had, but you didn't like explain yourself in the sense of, I'm a narratologist who studies, was it 18th century, 17th, 19th century literature? I'm sorry. Which one it was? Like
19th.
you didn't use 19th, thank you. I said 18th and I was like, that's not right. 19th century literature. And, you didn't say that. And if you had said that in your application letter to Stitch Fix, they probably would have been like, what? So
they would have been even more confused.
Yeah. So like you considered who you're talking to and like, how is it that this is going to be understood? And so I just think it's important to be able to restate one's skill set. So working, I think you said as a linguist or like a linguist, as that title versus using that skill set and being able to explain if you're working like one, using your skill set, then explaining what is that skill set to the person who you're interviewing with, talking to.
And I know oh, go ahead.
I can connect that back to what you were saying, Anna Marie, so that audience focus and the power of stories to make something abstract, concrete. In the resume that I sent to Stitch Fix, those bullet points underneath the jobs, I was very conscious of representing academic work in a way that it sounded like what a stylist would do. And, so I was emphasizing communication, collaboration, the ability to sort of read what a client, so treating the students that way, which actually worked because the people at Stitch Fix were young and really recent out of college. So, but that idea of, treating the student like a customer, and I put that in, and even the idea of pitching conference papers, like all of it, I just like this idea of you've got this audience, and I learned, I was showing like I was constantly having to adjust to an audience, and that the audiences, I had all these different audiences that I had to work with. And so I was working that in the bullet points. And that was the first time for that job was the first time I'd ever made a resume, because I'd only had CVs before. And that was the hardest part of applying for that job, was that transformation. And then it allowed me, though, to write this crazy cover letter that they ended up liking. But
well, one of the things that happened last week that lets me know, so Samantha Beaver, unprompted by me, arose as a topic in last week's webinar. Was it last week? 2 weeks ago? Alex Marsters.
2 weeks.
Who's had, well, I can't remember how she heard me telling a story about Samantha Beaver, but Samantha launched her business at a tech conference, which that's the story that I tell in chapter 1. So she thought about, how do you talk about linguistics to a group of tech people? And she talked about language as a technology. And that reframing is so sticky that 2 years later now, Alex Johnson remembered it and used it in this series, this webinar series, to talk about an interesting example of how somebody was able to do this audience design, talk about linguistics in a way that, makes somebody know, an audience know how it is that you're going to be useful to them. And I think Charlotte and Anne both do it in their own ways, in as I talk about in their stories. In Charlotte's case, it was NASA contacted her saying, gee, you've done this really interesting analysis of like power and language. Do you think you might have something to say about the power dynamics that play out in cockpits, in airline, cockpits? And she wasn't sure, but she trusted that she would find something interesting. And in Anne's case, it's, inviting a conversation that needs to be happening, but isn't. It's like a noisy knot in the way that Charlotte Lindy talks about, this is a conversation we need to be having about the role of African American language in, as a subject of inquiry, but also as a way of understanding the experience of inclusion in our discipline.
The other thing about Anne Charity Udley, her work, she knows how to adjust her work to audience as well. So I've used her work in my classroom. So when I was teaching with the pre-service teachers, what was it called? It's like language variation in U.S. schools. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. It's a blue and purple cover. Is that the right name?
I think that's right.
Okay. And it's written at a level that like a teacher could just pick it up and read it. And so like my students loved that book because it was so accessible, and like it was linguistic theory written for anybody who can get it. So like it's detailed, it's thoughtful, it's 100% correct at being at a level that anybody can approach it without having a linguistics career, linguistics background. And that's what I mean. Like you can take the same content and use it in these different areas and it's still 100% the same. It's just reframed, represented based on who is getting it. And so I think, I love that book for that reason. I recently gave it to my mom just because she was I was going to give it to a friend who's a teacher, and my mom was interested. Was like, "What is this?" And I was like, "Here, you read it, and then I'll give it to my friend who's a teacher." So I just think that that's also another awesome example of how you can take that linguistic background.
Well, and one loop that I want to close, I'm thinking about threads and knitting now.
I'll get in the name. I'll find a link for
it. One thing that we've kind of hit on in our Pocketful Story sessions that sort of connects back to, Christy, what you talked about, having so much fun in that job interview. In the Pocketful Story sessions, we've found that it's a fun thing to get somebody thinking about a creative outlet that they have. So like in one that we did just this week, it was someone who does Japanese drumming, and thinking about how does, the way that you do Japanese drumming shape the way that so in this case, it was a woman who works as a she helps people write grants applications. And so she was able to talk about like when she teaches Japanese drumming, there was just that moment, Katie, right? Like she said, one small thing that she can do when she's teaching somebody is to just turn around so that she's showing the drumming, like her right hand is their right hand, she turns around in front of them so that, and we kind of were able to say like, okay, think about that, like that tiny choice to do a perspective shift. You probably do that when you help somebody write a grant. And like, let's think of the correlate, let's think of the parallel. And like that just kind of unleashes your creativity. It takes the creativity that you have from one domain and it brings it over into describing how you do your work. And I think that's a way to kind of engage that game, like you were talking about. It's a sense of play.
Yes.
And when you're playing in a job interview, man, you're having fun. They're going to have fun. They're going to want to work with you because you seem like somebody you're just showing them that you're passionate and creative and fun.
And it's where your secret sauce comes out too. If it's a hobby, because the idea, we feel like different people, when we're doing different things and in different contexts, but we're really the same person. And so when we can bring over an insight from one context to another context, that's just part of finding that deep, being able to identify and, surface that deep self that we don't always show to people who we've just met. But in an interview situation, you have to do that, and that's what makes them kind of nerve-wracking and difficult.
Yeah. I love it. Well, any last questions from the participants about stories, storytelling? We've
I
talked a
put
lot
the
about.
link to the book
Oh,
in
thank you.
the chat. I put the Amazon link just because it's what came up. And then I also put in Ann Charity Headley's website, which has the link to that book as well. So if you're interested in those resources, they're there too. But one of the things that I wanted to just kind of bring back, and I mentioned this to Anne Marie right before we started, so I
Yeah.
thought I'd just close out with this as my final thing. So I've worked with Anna Marie for 3 years. We've done various things together, participated in, in the Career Linguists Network, and we did the workshop at Anthropological Association of America together for
In the before times.
in the before times. Yeah, I'm in Canada, and it was looking at using ethnographies and interviewing to better understand yourself, and then how you can apply that to better figure out your career and non-academic jobs and options like that. And so, I've had this understanding on some level of story approach to, job applying and to talking to people in the professional world, and how you can talk about what you do in terms of a story. But then, so last night I got to see Anna Marie and some of her fellow storytellers do a concert, and this was online. And it was just interesting to go to this, like, what we all think of as story, like the telling a story that maybe isn't real, or something that happened when you were 5, and out of this work context, because then I was like, oh, right, this is sticking with me because of this thing, like that story that person said, this was last night, oh, that was really interesting, the imagery they used there, or this part was really interesting because of the way they constructed that. And I was like, and that is why people remember your work stories, because of the way you construct it or the connections you make. And I feel like, I wouldn't say I didn't get it, but like, it was just nice to see like this narrative story construction in that more canonical definition that, like, when I know before I met you, like, had about the idea of story. It's something you tell my 5-year-old nephew,
Right.
It's not like something I use in an interview. And I think taking that approach or that mentality of like, it is a story, allows you to be more engaging, allows you to be more yourself, maybe. It allows you to just feel like you can integrate those different skill sets. I don't know. I feel like it makes it more meaningful. Yeah, meaningful. It makes it more meaningful. So,
Nice.
yeah.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, you're welcome.
How about you, Chrissy? Any last words about story listening, power of story?
In a way, to underscore what Katie was saying about liberating yourself from chronology, that's the difference. So as a narratologist, when we translate fabula and sujet, it's usually story and narrative. Story, chronological, narrative, not necessarily. But liberating yourself from that, even in your oral or informal stories, but especially in interview stories, and even when you're listening to other people's stories, like noticing that things are out of order. They often are. We do it unconsciously a lot of times. There's a reason, sometimes known to the teller, sometimes not, for why the two events are put together, even if they didn't happen in chronological order. But you can, as a teller, it's very powerful. And if you think of the 3 movements, just, in terms of your questions in chapter 1, where are you now? What brought you here? And where are you going? And if you think about that, if you're trying to, create some sort of introductory, like, hi, I am blah, and giving a sense of yourself, answer those questions, but tell them out of order. If you're at a networking event, it is probably better to lead with where you're trying to go, instead of like describing, where you are now or how you got here. And so you can think about that in terms of what, we said about audience. Just take those 3 questions and think, which of those questions is my audience, what answer are they most interested in? Lead
Mm,
with that. And then the others, it doesn't matter what order you tell them. I mean, it does in terms of the power, but it doesn't matter in terms of the truth of it, and sometimes we think, I have to tell it in order because
right.
that's the more truthful way or more transparent way. And there is a little truth to that, but it is almost always the most boring way. So I'll leave it with that.
Well, that sets me up perfectly. Oh,
Can I say one last thing?
yes.
This is one technique I used with some students. I would like put your story, your event on like a lazy Susan, like you turn around on a table, on a spinner or something like that. And you can look at it from different perspectives for different storytelling purposes. So like you were saying, we put them in different order of the events in different orders for purposes for impact. But like the same story has different purpose. Like this one is about collaboration. I can tell it about collaboration this time. I can tell it about my leadership the next time. I can tell it about like the actual skill set we use to solve this problem the next time, so like you can create that order of events for different purposes. And the way I liked to describe it to students was like, put it on a spinner and spin it around, like, analyzing a sculpture from different angles.
And we did one of those for people who want to check out an example of that in last week's webinar with an example of you telling a story about a workplace conflict that ended up becoming a great example to use in a job interview. So check that out on the YouTube channel. And I'll just say, yeah, this sets me up perfectly to talk about, we've talked about the 3 stories that I tell to start employing linguistics, but actually in the rest of the book, I adhered to a storytelling formula, no doubt shaped by many conversations with people here present, that starts with now. And actually many of my storytellers were confused because they didn't want to tell their story that way. But I sort of I invited them to, I didn't force them to, but I invited them to try it out with me because this is a type of story that I think my audience, people who are trying to think about transferability of skills, if we want to talk about it that way, but, or, working like a linguist is another way to think about it. I asked these people to tell me what's something you're doing right now, right? Like, so tell me something that happened, yesterday, or something that you're working on, a project, and we'd get into it, and I'd be listening, story listening, as they were talking, and I was listening for that like little nugget that could just exemplify a thing, a unit of discourse, a linguistic theory, something that a student would recognize as something they learned in class, but coming to life out in the working world. And then we would jump back to the past in the story with the storyteller. I'd jump back to their past to think about, where did you learn that? Why did you, bring that with you to this job that you do now? And then project forward. Because I think that's a formula. It is a formula to master, like you were saying, Chrissy, in the tell me about yourself genre, that often is a way that people start an interview. Tell me about yourself. In a job interview, it's great if you can talk about present,
Yes,
past, and then leap into the future. So let's do that now. Thank you for being here in this present moment. We are thrilled that you have come along with us on this journey of exploring some of the themes in employing linguistics. And we hope that it inspires you in future to stay tuned. Employing Linguistics will be out in 2021. And yeah, I will look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. And thank you, my lovely guests. What a wonderful way to end the series. And get out there, the rest of you, ask for stories, listen for them. Harness the power of story listening for yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you. Bye.
Bye.